bien?
And people tried to tell us and tried to explain to us or help us understand, but maybe we just didn't get it. It was just very hard to conceive of something so awful actually being meticulously planned and carried out.
In central Kigali, a group of friends gathered for dinner at the home of a young American diplomat, Laura Lane.
We had a couple friends over, and you know, we just sat down to dinner, and all of a sudden there was a huge explosion, and I didn't instantly, you know, come to me what that was, because I wasn't used to hearing those kinds of sounds.
And then at 8:30, the first phone call came in, saying that originally the first phone call said that there had been a big explosion in Kanombe camp, which is just at the end of the runway of the airfield, the Kigali airfield, saying that it looked like an ammunition dump had exploded.
And it went from there's been an explosion at the airport to we think it's the ammunition dump at Kanombe that's blown up to it's a plane that's crashed to it's the presidential plane that's crashed.
Someone had fired a missile that shot down the Hutu president's airplane. Even 10 years later, the responsibility for the attack remains a mystery.
There are many theories as to who shot down the plane. I don't know if anybody has the answer to that. Was it Hutu extremists or was it Tutsi extremists? Was it done by the Tutsis as an excuse to begin the movement south by the RPF and take control of the country? Hard to say. Or was it used by the Hutu extremists to begin the genocide that took place? I don't know the answer to that.
That night, UN commanders were summoned to a crisis meeting at Rwandan Army headquarters.
We were heading through very darkened streets in Kigali, very quiet streets. There was no one. The streets were just empty. It was like a ghost town.
They found a leading Hutu extremist, Colonel Theoneste Bagosora, in control.
Colonel Bagosora, who was the chef de cabinet of the Minister of National Defense and a hardline person, in fact, considered even more than hardline. He was chairing the meeting.
Bagosora had once vowed to launch an apocalypse against the Tutsis. Dallaire insisted he step aside and hand power to the moderate acting Prime Minister, Madame Agath. Dallaire knew she would resist the extremists' power grab and appeal for calm.
Bagosora kept saying that she is of no use, and she never was able to garner her cabinet anyways.
And an officer that was sitting next to me stunk of booze. Started swearing in French underneath his breath about her and calling her various names. And so we were stalemated.
Dallaire asked UN headquarters for guidance. They responded by tightening his rules of engagement. He was ordered not to intervene, and above all, to avoid armed conflict.
We were concerned, one, that Dallaire and his force didn't have the capacity and didn't to take on that sort of responsibility, and that if they attempted to do it and any of the peacekeepers were killed, we may see a repeat of Somalia, and we may not even be able to offer any assistance.
You heard gunshots, you heard screams, you heard just so much activity that you knew this was going to be, you know, an awful night. And in the darkness, you were just, I remember feeling like, I don't want the daylight to come because I don't want to see, knowing what I'm hearing.
Well, what's going on here, huh? We got all the kids in the hallway and the television. This is April 7. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we were woken up at about 5:15, 5:20 by a lot of gunfire and stuff.
Yeah, the killing was happening right there. Our kids were listening in while they're describing on the radio, and I'm talking back to them and saying how people are being killed in their front yard, and I'm saying we're trying to get help, and we're just trying to figure out what we can do. This whole drama's unfolding, and our kids are standing there glued to this thing, and all of a sudden I go, whoa, I see, you know, one of them standing there and just transfixed, and I say, Teresa, take them away.
That morning, Dallaire sent Belgian and Ghanaian peacekeepers to guard Madame Agath, the moderate prime minister. Then he went to find the extremist leadership.
Agath was getting all the protection she needed, at least we expected it needed. I mean, they ended up by having 25 troops there. With that sort of in hand, my job now, because I was moving around, is to go get a hold of Bagassor and say, well, okay, what's going on now? What is the situation? Roadblocks were coming up. But as I got closer to the inner core of the city, the roadblocks became more serious, and ultimately the roadblocks in that inner circle there was controlled by the Presidential Guard. And so we made our way to the Ministry of Defense. Nobody was there. So I said, well, maybe they're right back to where they were last night. So just turned and went towards the ESM.
As Dallaire looked for the extremist leaders, the Prime Minister's house was surrounded by Rwandan troops. Inside, UN peacekeepers sent to protect her were under orders not to use force. The Prime Minister called her neighbor, American diplomat Joyce Leader.
About 8:30 in the morning, she called and asked if she could come and hide in my house.
The Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister. And I didn't give it very much thought, and I said yes. But then when the Ghanaian peacekeeper who was guarding her, he must have put a ladder up on her side of the fence, and he came up he raised his head above the fence, and there were shots fired just then.
Rwandan troops stormed the Prime Minister's compound. The peacekeepers radioed for instructions from Dallaire's Ghanaian deputy.
We were in communication with them all along, and it was not even rational for them to try to oppose them. The best they could do was to talk to them, to negotiate, to tell them, look, what you're about to do is wrong, you cannot do it.
At gunpoint, the UN troops surrendered their weapons to the Rwandans. The Ghanaian peacekeepers were soon released, but the 10 Belgian troops were taken hostage and led away.
Their radios became silent. Then you suspected something had gone wrong because communication was suddenly cut off. Then you sense danger. Something must have happened.
About another half hour later, we actually heard a scream and a shot and realized that it was the Prime Minister who had been found and killed.
General Dallaire hadn't heard of the attack, but he'd learned the extremist leadership was meeting at Army headquarters. As he approached, Dallaire caught a glimpse of his soldiers inside the Army compound, lying in the dirt.
And at the gate, as we went by, I saw 2 soldiers in a Belgian uniform lying on the ground about 50-odd meters inside the camp. And so your whole life is dependent on those nanoseconds of taking that right decisions, because it's life and death. I was already saying, I can't get those guys out of there. I just don't have the forces or the deployment capability. I've got so many other troops that I don't know of, and all the vulnerability of the rest. I can't take these bastards on. To do anything for them and for the others, I had to negotiate.
Dallaire carried on through the next gate to confront the extremist leadership. But he decided not to mention his troops, who he knew were being beaten 200 yards away.
What I said was, get a grip of your units. I'm staying. The informant, Jean-Pierre, had told us that they were trying to set up to wipe out a dozen or so, or 10 Belgians, in order to break the back of our mission, because if the Belgians pulled out, I had no real substantive capability to sustain myself, and that the international community would pull us all out. These guys knew about Mogadishu also. And so what I was making clear to them is that I'm staying.
Dallaire later demanded to know what had happened to the Belgians, but he took no military action to rescue his troops.
Finally, a phone call after insistence came and said that they are all at the hospital, at the morgue. And so I said, right, let's go. The morgue was a little shack, and a bit of an L-shaped small shack. And there was a 25-watt bulb at best. And there in the corner of the L shape was this pile of potato bags. Just looked like a pile of big, huge potato bags. And as we got closer, we saw that they were bodies.
In the wake of Somalia, the murder of more Western peacekeepers triggered an immediate response.
Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to start with the situation in Rwanda. The President called the Secretary of State this morning to express the President's concern about the safety of Americans in Rwanda in light of the deteriorating situation there.
By that morning, we kind of had a sense that we were not going to be able to wait this out. I took our wedding album, we took our guns, and put the dog at our feet, and literally slumped down in the car and drove down the streets, like just looking over the dashboard, you know, as we hear fire in the background, and made it to the embassy.
The Clinton administration ordered an immediate evacuation of all 257 U.S. citizens in Rwanda. It was up to Laura Lane to get every American out alive.
We said we have to, you know, evacuate the American community out because we couldn't risk, you know, their lives trying to wait this out, because if this was a plan, it had a larger purpose, and that larger purpose would not be good where you'd want anyone in harm's way.
But Lane told Washington she wanted to stay and keep the embassy open as a safe haven for Rwandans.
I felt very, very strongly that if there is someone who is planning this kind of evil, they need to know that there is also another group, that we, the Americans, will stand right here and stand against them.